The morning of December 17th, 1944, near the Belgian village of Boulingen, Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper stood in the cold beside a column of idling German tanks and watched American prisoners fill his fuel tanks by hand. His men had overrun a United States supply point not long before. Inside it, they found around 50,000 gallons of gasoline, stacked in cans and drums. Now, captured soldiers from an American quartermaster unit were carrying those cans to the panzers and emptying them in, watched over by SS troopers holding rifles. Paper commanded the spearhead of the entire German offensive in the Ardennes. He was 29 years old, and he'd been trusted with the most important armored thrust of the attack. On the second morning of the greatest German gamble in the West, the fuel keeping his tanks alive was not German fuel. It was American gasoline, captured by accident, poured by men who had expected to spend that morning eating breakfast. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. That scene was not the bad luck of one morning. It was built into the plan. The German High Command had launched the Ardennes offensive knowing the attacking divisions did not carry enough fuel to reach their objective. The plan assumed, openly, that the panzers would seize American gasoline along the way and run on it. An entire army was being asked to win a campaign on fuel it did not yet possess and intended to take from the enemy. To understand why German officers thought this way, you have to understand the war they had been fighting for 5 years. Germany had almost no oil of its own. The Reich's domestic oil fields were small. To wage a modern war, it leaned on two crutches. The first was Romania and the oil fields at Ploesti. The second was synthetic fuel, gasoline manufactured out of coal in enormous chemical plants. By the height of the war, those synthetic plants were producing a large share of all the liquid fuel the German military used, including most of its aviation gasoline. The single largest of them, run by the chemical combined IG Farben at Luna, had become one of the most important industrial sites in Europe. In the spring of 1944, the Allies decided to destroy it. Beginning in May, American and British bombers turned away to the strategic air campaign onto German oil. They struck Luna again and again. They struck the other synthetic plants. By late August, they had wrecked Ploesti, which fell to the advancing Soviets and stopped producing entirely. German synthetic fuel output, the lifeblood of the Panzer divisions and the Luftwaffe, collapsed. By the middle of the year, it had fallen to less than a quarter of its pre-war level, and it kept falling after that. Albert Speer, the man running German war production, understood at once what was happening. After the first heavy raid on the synthetic plants in May, he went to Hitler and told him plainly that the enemy had struck at one of Germany's weakest points. If they persist at it this time, Speer warned, we will soon no longer have any fuel production worth mentioning. They persisted. Within months, German fuel reserves were a fraction of what an army at war required. Luftwaffe squadrons sat on their airfields because there was no aviation gasoline to fly them. Panzer units that should have been racing across the map waited in place, counting every liter. Across the whole war, from 1940 to 1945, German oil consumption fell by around 86%. The German army did not run out of courage or guns or shells. It ran out of fuel. So a German officer in 1944 had spent his entire war learning a single lesson about gasoline. There is never enough. Fuel was a thing you counted by the can. It was a thing that decided whether you could attack at all. Erwin Rommel, who had watched his tank strand in the North African desert for want of petrol, had said it as bluntly as any soldier could. Guns and ammunition, he wrote, are of little use in modern war unless there is enough petrol to move them around. That was the mind that planned the Ardennes. Men who had measured fuel by the spoonful for their whole careers looked across the line at the American army and assumed, naturally, that the enemy lived under the same iron law they did. They assumed the Americans also rationed every can, also planned each mile against a gauge. They were wrong, and the size of how wrong they were is the whole of the story. There is one more thing to understand about the German army before we cross to the American side, and it is the part of the war that popular memory hides most completely. The Wehrmacht was not a fully motorized force. It never had been. For all the newsreel images of mass tanks rolling forward, the great majority of the German army moved on foot and on hooves. Germany went to war in 1939 with around 514,000 horses in military service. Over the course of the war, it would use roughly 2.75 million horses and mules, with something like 1,100,000 of them in service at any given time. The horses pulled the artillery. They pulled the supply wagons that fed the infantry and the field kitchens that fed the men. Of the 322 German Army and SS divisions that existed in November of 1943, only 52 were armored or motorized. The rest, the bulk of German fighting strength, marched into battle the way armies had marched 100 years earlier, with their guns and their supplies drawn by animals. The historian Adam Tooze, who studied the German war economy in detail, summed it up in 3 words. The Wehrmacht, he wrote, was a poor army. Its fast, motorized corps was small. 3/4 of it ran on muscle and oats. This is the gap that mattered most. When German commanders tried to picture how the Americans supplied themselves, they were reasoning from inside an army that still measured part of its own logistics and forage for animals. The question of how the enemy kept his trucks running was, to them, just a larger version of their own daily problem. It did not occur to them, because nothing in their experience let it occur to them, that the Americans were not playing the same game at all. The American game was different at its very foundation. The United States in the 1940s was the oil country of the world. In 1940, it pumped something like 1 1/3 billion barrels of crude, around 63% of all the oil produced on Earth. It was not only the largest producer, it had a surplus, more than 1 million barrels a day of spare capacity, room to grow that no other nation came close to matching. The numbers at the start of the war tell the story by themselves. The United States was consuming roughly 3.5 million barrels of oil a day. Germany was consuming around 170,000. The American figure was more than 20 times the German one, and the Americans backed that production with engineering on the same scale. When German submarines began sinking the coastal tankers that carried oil up from Texas, the United States simply built 2 of the longest pipelines in the world, more than 1,400 miles of pipe laid across the continent. The larger one moving 300,000 barrels of crude every single day. By the end of the war, American oil amounted to about 6 billion of the roughly 7 billion barrels the Allied nations consumed. More than 85% of the fuel that drove the entire Allied war effort came out of American ground. For the United States, fuel was never the scarce thing. The scarce thing was getting it to the right place at the right time. The American problem with gasoline was not whether it existed. It was distribution. And the Americans attacked the problem of distribution with the same crushing industrial weight they brought to everything else. That weight showed up in objects, and one of the smallest of them carried a strange secret. The standard fuel can the Americans use in Europe. The flat rectangular 5-gallon container that a single soldier could lug in each hand was not an American invention. It was German. The design had been created inside Germany in 1937 by an engineer named Vinzenz Grunvogel at the Muller firm. The German army called it the Wehrmacht Standard Canister. It was a genuinely brilliant piece of work, stackable and tough and fast to pour, built so that one man could carry 2 full cans or 4 empty ones. By 1939, the German military had thousands of them stockpiled, ready for the invasion of Poland. It was so far ahead of anything the Allies had that an American engineer named Paul Place, who had been on a long road trip through Germany before the war, smuggled 3 of the cans out of a stockpile at a Berlin airport and carried the specifications home. The Allies copied the design down to the last detail. American soldiers, who called the Germans Jerry, called the copy Jerrycan, and the name carries a joke inside it. The single best tool for moving fuel by hand in that war was something the Americans took from the enemy and then built in quantities the enemy could never have dreamed of. The trucks that carried those cans were the real monument. The workhorse of American supply was a GMC 2.5-ton truck, the vehicle every soldier called the Deuce and a Half. It was not handsome. It was built largely out of civilian parts, simple to fix in a muddy field, almost impossible to wear out. The United States produced more than 560,000 of them, around 1/4 of every truck the country built during the entire war. A single Deuce and a Half, loaded with nothing but jerrycans, could carry around 875 gallons of gasoline forward to the front. Multiply that by the tens of thousands rolling across France, and you begin to see the shape of the thing the German officers could not picture. Here's where the story turns, because for one stretch the Americans nearly proved the Germans right. In the late summer of 1944, the United States Army very nearly did run out of fuel. After the breakout from Normandy in August, the American armies ran east across France far faster than anyone had planned. George Patton's Third Army, in particular, tore across the country, moving so quickly that it left its own supply lines hundreds of miles behind. The fuel could not keep up. Within a single week, the gasoline the Third Army needed each day doubled, from 300,000 gallons to 600,000. Tanks sat motionless on the roads of France, stopped not by the Germans but by empty tanks. Patton was furious. His men, he said, could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. He was convinced, with good reason, that he could have driven clean into Germany that autumn, if only the fuel had been there to do it. For a few weeks, the distance between the American army and the German army shrank almost to nothing. Both were stalled by gasoline. The difference that decided the war, was what each side did about it. The German answer to a fuel shortage, 3 months later, would be to bet an entire offensive on stealing the enemy's gasoline. The American answer, that August, was to build a river of trucks. They called it the Red Ball Express. It was put together in a single marathon planning session of barely a day and a half, and it began running on August 25, 1944. The idea was simple and enormous. Take thousands of trucks, give them a dedicated loop of road closed to all civilian traffic, and run them day and night, carrying supplies from the Normandy beaches to the moving front. One route ran forward, loaded. A parallel route ran back, empty. The trucks did not stop. The scale of the need was staggering on its own. General Omar Bradley later worked the arithmetic in his memoirs. Each of his divisions required something like 700 to 750 tons of supply a day, and he had 28 divisions pushing across France and Belgium. That came to roughly 20,000 tons every day, just to keep the armies breathing. At its peak, the Red Ball Express ran almost 6,000 vehicles. They hauled around 12,500 tons of supplies a day. The single largest category of that tonnage was fuel, because the two armies it served, Patton's Third and Courtney Hodges' First, were together burning roughly 800,000 gallons of gasoline every day. The trucks ran routes that stretched as long as 686 miles round trip. They ran them at night, without headlights to hide from German aircraft. The drivers, about 3/4 of them black soldiers serving in a still segregated army, drove until they fell asleep at the wheel, and a few of them quietly damaged their own trucks just to earn an hour of rest. The officer who set the whole thing up, Brigadier General Ewart Plank, gave his men one instruction that captured the entire American attitude toward the fuel problem. Let it never be said, he told them, that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't. Eisenhower himself called the Red Ball line the lifeline between combat and supply. Sit with what that actually means. The American army hit a fuel crisis, a real one, the same kind of crisis that was slowly strangling Germany to death. And within days it answered that crisis by summoning 6,000 trucks out of its own depots and pouring 800,000 gallons of gasoline a day down a custom-built highway across a foreign country. It treated a shortage that would have crippled any other army on Earth as a problem to be solved over a long weekend. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was the world that Joachim Peiper's tanks drove into in December of 1944. He had been ordered to capture American fuel because Germany no longer had any to spare him. What no one on the German side understood, what they could not understand because nothing in their own war had prepared them for it, was just how much American fuel was waiting out there in the dark and how little difference it would make even on the day he finally found some. For the first 2 days, it looked as though Peiper might pull it off. His battle group was the cutting edge of the whole offensive, the lead element of the 1st SS Panzer Division, which was itself the weighted thrust of the entire 6th Panzer Army. His orders were to bypass anything that fought back and drive without pause to the bridges over the Meuse. Reach the Meuse, and the door to the Allied rear would swing open. He had trained his men in night movement for exactly this kind of attack. In the first hours, he tore a hole in the thin American line and pushed deep, faster and farther than any other German column in the offensive. But the fuel problem rode with him from the very start. The Tiger and Panther tanks that gave his force its power were enormous machines, some of them weighing close to 70 tons. And they drank gasoline at a rate that made every mile withdraw from a count that was already nearly empty. A heavy German tank of that kind had famously poor fuel economy. It could not march far on a full load before it needed more, and across muddy ground or up the steep Ardennes hills it drank faster still. The 50,000 gallons his men seized at Boulingen on the 17th bought him time. It did not buy him distance, and distance was the whole point of the operation. On December 18th, Paper's spearhead crossed the Amblev River at the town of Stavelot and pushed on to the west. Here the geography of the battle set a trap that no German planner had drawn on any map. A short way to the north of Stavelot, up a minor road toward the village of Francorchamps, sat one of the largest concentrations of gasoline on the European continent. 2 United States First Army fuel depots stood within a few miles of Paper's line of advance. Together, they held more than 3 million gallons of motor fuel. It was enough gasoline to carry Paper's panzers not just to the Meuse, but all the way to Antwerp, the final objective of the entire offensive. It was, in the most literal sense, everything he needed parked in cans by the side of a Belgian road. Almost nothing stood between the German tanks and that fuel. The American officer in the area, Major Paul Solis, had only a handful of men and a single anti-tank gun, and most of his force had already fallen back. With German tanks climbing the hill behind his last platoon, and no real way to stop them, Solis did the only thing he could. He had his men seize gasoline from the Francorchamps dump, pour into a deep cut in the road where there was no way around, and set it on fire. The result was a wall of flame across the only path forward. It made a perfect anti-tank barrier. The German tanks, seeing the road ahead turn into a river of burning fuel, turned back toward Stavelot. Solis burned 124,000 gallons of gasoline to build that barrier. This is the detail that tells you everything about the two armies. That 124,000 gallons, a quantity that would have been a strategic treasure to any German commander in the West, was the only fuel the entire United States First Army lost during the whole Battle of the Bulge. The Americans set a fortune in gasoline on fire to slow one column of tanks for a few hours, and the loss barely registered in their accounts. Think about what 3 million gallons would have meant in Paper's hands. His attack had been launched with fuel for only a few days of fighting. The dumps north of Stavelot held more gasoline than his entire division could have burned reaching the sea. The fuel that would have turned his stalled gamble into the breakthrough Hitler had promised himself was sitting within sight of his route, guarded by a few dozen men. And the German command never even knew to send patrol up the road to look. What makes the moment stranger still is that Paper never understood what was sitting beside him. His men never even ventured up the Francorchamps road toward the dumps. The German intelligence picture of American supply was so thin that his spearhead passed within a few hundred yards of 3 million gallons of fuel, more than enough to change the course of the battle, and his command never knew it was there. Years later, the 1965 film about the battle would invent a dramatic ending in which a German panzer commander modeled on Paper reaches an American fuel depot and dies in the attempt to take it. The truth was quieter and far more revealing. There was no climactic battle at the fuel dump. The Americans up the road actually ordered the flames put out once they realized the Germans were heading elsewhere, because they wanted the road clear to bring their own troops in to fight. The fuel that could have saved Paper's offensive sat untouched in the dark while the German tanks drove past it. Hunting for gasoline, they were certain had to be somewhere ahead. After Stavelot, the trap closed quickly. Paper pushed west toward the villages of Stillmont and La Glise, but the bridges he needed were blown in his face one after another, and the American defense stiffened with every hour. The men of the 30th Infantry Division, the veterans who called themselves Old Hickory, fought him in the valley. Paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne and the tanks of the 3rd Armored Division pressed in from the north and the west. Behind him, the Americans retook Stavelot and cut the road his own division would have used to reach him with fuel and reinforcements. Paper's drive, the most dangerous German thrust of the entire offensive, had been halted in roughly 3 days. He pulled his force back into a small pocket around Stillmont and La Glise, an area his own men took to call in the cauldron, and went over to the defensive. He was not holding that ground because he wanted it. He was holding it because he could no longer move. He admitted as much afterward. His men, he said, had begun to realize that they did not have enough gasoline even across the bridge west of Stillmont. The tanks that had torn through the American line 4 days earlier now sat in the snow with empty fuel tanks, waiting for a relief that the Americans had already made impossible. By December 23rd, his battle group was surrounded and reduced about a quarter of the strength it had started with, and it was almost entirely out of fuel. On the night of December 24th, Paper made his decision. There was no way to drive out. The fuel simply was not there. So he did the only thing left to a commander whose machines could not move. He ordered his remaining tanks and vehicles destroyed, blew up what he could, and led the survivors out of Caldon on foot. Around 800 men walked back toward the German lines through the winter woods, leaving behind them the most powerful armor in the German inventory. The Tiger and Panther tanks that had been built at enormous cost, that could destroy almost any Allied tank they met in a straight fight, were left standing in the streets of the Belgian village because there was no gasoline to carry them away. One of those King Tiger tanks, the 68-ton machine numbered 213, was left exactly where it stopped. It is still there today, parked beside the village museum in La Glise, a monument to a weapon that was not beaten in battle. It simply ran dry. A tank without fuel is not a breakthrough weapon. It is a steel obstacle. Paper's men learned that lesson in the snow outside La Glise, and they walked home to prove it, across the whole Ardennes battle. The same scene repeated itself wherever the German column stalled. Tanks and half-tracks and trucks were left at the roadside, not knocked out by enemy fire, but stranded for want of fuel and then abandoned. The German army frequently could not even recover its own broken-down vehicles, because the recovery vehicles needed gasoline too. The greatest German offensive in the West left a trail of expensive, undamaged machinery sitting silent in the snow. The clearest window into the German blindness came months later, after the war was over. In September of 1945, an American Army historian named Ken Heckler sat down to interview the captured Paper about the offensive. At one point, Heckler asked him a simple question: where had he expected to capture the gasoline his attack depended on? Paper explained that his division's intelligence officer had carried a situation map that claimed to show the American supply installations, and that the Germans had believed, on the strength of that map, that they could refuel at Boulingen and at Stavelot. It was a reasonable answer from inside the German way of war. You located the enemy's small, precious fuel stocks, and you planned to take them. Then Heckler told him the truth. He asked Paper whether he had realized that he had come within 300 yards of 3-million-gallon gasoline dump at Spa. There is no record that Paper had an answer. The exchange says everything about the gap this story is built around. The German command had gone into the battle with a sketch of American supply, a few dumps marked on a map. The reality was an ocean of fuel so vast that the spearhead of their greatest offensive had driven right past a fortune in gasoline without ever seeing it. They were not playing the same game. They could not even see the board. For a professional soldier, it must have been a strange thing to learn after the fact. Paper had done nearly everything his training asked of him, and he had failed anyway, beaten less by the men in front of him than by the size of the thing behind them. The fuel story is not the only thing history records about Camp Grub Paper, and honesty requires the rest of it. On December 17th, the same headlong dash that captured the gasoline at Boulingen, Paper's column overran an American convoy near the Belgian town of Malmedy and murdered the prisoners it took. Around 84 American soldiers, men who had already surrendered, were shot down in a snow-covered field. It became known as the Malmedy Massacre, one of the most infamous war crimes committed against American troops anywhere in the European War. Paper survived the battle and the war. He was tried for the massacre, sentenced to death, and then saw his sentence commuted. He was released from prison in the middle of the 1950s and went to live quietly in France. In 1976, his house was attacked and set on fire, and he was killed inside it. The commander whose tanks had run dry in the Ardennes died more than 30 years later in the country he had once helped to invade. The Ardennes offensive failed for many reasons. The Americans fought with stubborn courage in places like Bastogne and the Amblette Valley. The plan was too ambitious for the forces and the roads it was given. But underneath all of it sat the one constraint Germany could never escape: The offensive had been launched with only a few days of fuel, on the gamble that the rest could be stolen, because Germany no longer had the fuel to give its own army. That was not the failure of one battle. It was a slow result of the entire war. The Allied bombing of the synthetic fuel plants in the spring and summer of 1944 had done exactly what Albert Speer warned Hitler would do. Germany's fuel production withered, and an army that had conquered most of the continent found itself rationing gasoline by the liter, while its enemy moved through an endless surplus. This is the honest answer to the question this story began with. German officers were not stupid, and they were not blind in any ordinary sense. They were highly capable professionals who had simply never lived inside a war where fuel was not the thing that decided everything. They could not grasp how American trucks never ran out of gasoline because, in their world, running out of gasoline was a natural condition of an army at war. George Patton, on the American side, complained that his chief difficulty was not the Germans but gasoline, and he meant the trouble of getting it forward fast enough. He never once had to fear that it might not exist. America's armies in Europe burned something like 100 times more gasoline than American forces had used in the entire First World War, and the supply held. It is worth saying plainly, the German soldier was not outfought as an individual, and German equipment was often the equal or the better of an American counterpart. What defeated Germany in the West, more than any single battle, was the simple fact that one side had built an industrial machine that could put fuel in trucks and supplies wherever they were needed, in any quantity, for as long as the war lasted, and the other side had not. The men who actually won that side of the war do not have many statues. They were not the famous generals. They were the drivers of the Red Ball Express and the supply troops behind them, about 3/4 of them black soldiers serving in an army that still kept them separate and rarely let them into the headlines. They drove the deuce-and-a-half trucks down those closed roads through the autumn of 1944 at night, without headlights, until they fell asleep at the wheel. The roads were narrow and slick with autumn rain. The schedule was merciless, and the trucks were pushed so hard that breakdowns and wrecks were a daily fact of the operation. The drivers ran two to a cab and traded off the wheel to keep the convoys moving around the clock. They kept Patton's tanks and Hodges' infantry rolling across France, while the German army a few miles away began to starve for the one thing the Americans never lacked. When the Great Port of Antwerp finally opened and the railroads were running again, the Red Ball Express was quietly stood down on November 16, 1944. In its few months, it had carried more than 412,000 tons of supplies to the front. Then the drivers went back to their units, and most of their names disappeared from the story. They had not won a battle anyone could point on a map. They had done something less visible and far more decisive. They had made sure the tanks never stopped. Which brings us back to where this began, on that coal road outside Boulingen on the morning of December 17, 1944. A German officer in command of the finest soldiers and the heaviest tanks his country could build, kept alive for one more morning by American gasoline that his men had to steal and pour by hand, on his way to a dump of 3 million gallons that lay 300 yards off his route, that he could not see and that he would never reach. Behind him lay an enemy army that did not ration fuel at all, an army that burned 124,000 gallons as a roadblock without feeling the loss, and answered its own fuel crisis by conjuring 6,000 trucks in a single weekend. Germany built better tanks. It built the Tiger and the Panther, machines the Americans feared in a fair fight. But the war in the West was not decided by the tank. It was decided by the gallon, and by the truck that carried it, and by the country that had so much of both that it could afford to set a fortune on fire just to slow one man down. Joachim Paper understood tanks. What he could not understand, what the entire German command could not understand, was that they had already lost the only war that finally mattered, the quiet war of fuel and trucks and the long gray convoys that never stopped rolling. The men who actually won that side of the war do not have many statues. They were not the famous generals. They were the drivers of the Red Ball Express and the supply troops behind them, about 3/4 of them black soldiers serving in an army that still kept them separate and rarely let them into the headlines. But to understand what they accomplished, you have to sit with the numbers for a moment longer than the histories usually ask you to. The Red Ball Express ran for 81 days. In those 81 days, it moved more than 412,000 tons of supplies across France. That figure is almost too large to carry meaning. Break it down instead into what it took to produce it. 6,000 trucks, tens of thousands of drivers working in shifts, mechanics keeping engines running on roads that were not built for that weight or that traffic, dispatchers routing convoys through towns that had been rubble 6 weeks earlier, fuel depot workers filling tanks at all hours, so the trucks themselves never ran dry while carrying fuel forward for the tanks ahead of them. The entire operation was a machine feeding itself while feeding an army. The drivers ran to a cab when they could. When they could not, they drove alone in the dark on roads they could not see, with no headlights, reading the road through the feel of the steering and the vibration through the floor. Some of them drove for 20, 30, 40 consecutive hours. The Army had issued regulations limiting driving shifts to precisely this kind of dangerous stretch, and the regulations were ignored because the schedule was more important than the regulation. A few drivers fell asleep at the wheel and drove into ditches or off embankments. The Army counted these as operational losses, the same category as a truck with a broken axle, and sent the next one through. What is hard to convey about those 81 days is the absence of drama. There was no moment when everything hung on a single convoy, no last-minute dash that turned the battle. The Red Ball worked because it was relentless and because it did not stop. On the 81st day, it was doing exactly what it had done on the first day. Only the roads were more worn and the drivers were more tired, and the front was further away. The Army it served never ran short of fuel again that autumn. That was the achievement, not a battle won, but a condition maintained. The racial arithmetic of the Express matters here in ways that the post-war histories long declined to pursue. The United States Army in 1944 was organized on the premise, stated plainly in official doctrine, that black soldiers were best employed in service and support roles rather than combat. The reasons given were never scientific and frequently contradicted by the units the Army kept segregated at great administrative cost. The practical effect was that the men most likely to be driving trucks on the Red Ball, loading ships at Cherbourg, stacking ammunition at forward depots, and keeping the supply chain functioning were black. When 3/4 of the Red Ball drivers were black soldiers, that was not an accident of assignment. It was a direct consequence of a policy that channeled black military labor into the work that made white combat divisions possible. The irony embedded in that arrangement is almost too blunt to require stating, but it requires stating anyway. The Army that was fighting, in part, a war against a regime built on racial hierarchy, maintained its own racial hierarchy in the supply chain that kept the fighting going. The men who were told they could not be trusted to fight were the men most responsible for ensuring that the men trusted to fight never had to stop for want of fuel or food or ammunition. Post-war memory did not correct this. The Red Ball got its acknowledgement in the histories, but the acknowledgement was thin, and the names were not recorded with the care given to divisional commanders. The inequity of the historical record mirrors the inequity of the original arrangement. An army that would not let black soldiers eat in the same mess hall, as white ones was not going to expend equal effort preserving their service records for posterity. The correction has been slow and partial, and this account cannot complete it. What it can do is refuse the habit of mentioning the racial composition of the Red Ball as a footnote, and instead place it where it belongs, at the center of what the story is about. Because what the story is about, at its foundation, is the relationship between industrial capacity and military outcome. The United States won the logistics war in Western Europe because it had more trucks and more fuel and more organizational capacity than its enemy. But it also had more of all those things because of the labor of people it simultaneously refused to treat as equals. The abundance that made the Red Ball possible was built in American factories by workers, many of them black, who were migrating north in enormous numbers to take industrial jobs the war had suddenly made available. The trucks they built were driven across France by soldiers the Army kept segregated. The fuel that filled those trucks came from oil fields and refineries that employed workers under conditions that were themselves shaped by race and class. None of that complexity fits inside a war film. It barely fits inside a single paragraph. But it is the actual texture of the thing that defeated Germany in the West. Not a clean industrial triumph, but a messy, deeply unequal human effort that somehow produced a logistics capability the enemy could not match and could not even fully imagine. Which brings us back one final time, to the coal road outside Boulingen on the morning of December 17th. Papers tanks, idling in the dark. American prisoners carrying cans. 3 million gallons sitting 300 yards off his route, unknown, untouched, waiting. Behind him, the entire apparatus. The depots and the convoys and the drivers running without headlights through the autumn dark. The jerrycans stacked by the millions. The deuce-and-a-half trucks grinding east and west on a closed highway across a foreign country. An industrial civilization that had decided to win a war and had brought everything it owned to the task. Germany built the better tank. America built everything else. In the end, everything else was enough, and the better tank sat in the snow at La Glise and waited for fuel that was never coming. The gallon won. The truck won. The long gray convoy that never stopped won. That is the story, and that is where it ends. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.